Thank you for being here. We're in the panel on transforming community supervision. We have a fantastic slate of panelists up here. My name is Amy Solomon. I am with Arnold Ventures, and we're going to have a three-part conversation. The first part of our discussion is going to focus on the national landscape and what probation and parole look like now and what the reforms that we're talking about look like now. The second part of the discussion is going to focus on what we're learning from states and jurisdictions that are already have adopted reforms. And there are already lots of lessons learned that we want to draw out into this conversation. And the third part is to talk a little bit about what's on the horizon, what's coming next, what tools may be out there for people who are thinking about reforms in your jurisdictions. And then we are told that we must leave. We're going to leave a half hour for Q&A at the end, so there'll be lots of time to get in your questions at the end. And so with that, let me give some brief introductions here. And I won't give full bios, it would take too long, but I am going to do a little bit more than title, because you need to know who these people are and what they're representing. And to my right here is Erica Pruitt, who is the director of Multnomah County Department of Community Justice in Portland, Oregon. And Erica's been there for 20 years, lots of perspectives and roles there, but also holds a national lens. She's the recent past president of the American Probation and Parole Association. And I love that in her bio, you don't see this very often, she says that her core value is that people can change. Vinnie Schiraldi is next. He's the senior research scientist at Columbia School of Social Work and the co-director of the Columbia Justice Lab. And what I think is unusual about Vinnie, so many things to say, but he, a couple of decades ago was working in outside organizations and kind of lobbying big, bold ideas about how things should be different. And it's pretty easy to do that from the outside. But then Vinnie was asked now multiple times to come in and do it, make that happen. And he did it. He ran the juvenile corrections in Washington, D.C. and transformed that organization. And then he was the commissioner of the New York City Department of Probation. And, made sweeping changes there to the size and the approach of probation in this big city here. And we're going to hear a lot about how he's taking some of those lessons and applying it to reform campaigns around the country. Justice Michael Boggs is sitting by Vinnie. He was appointed to the Supreme Court of Georgia in 2016. And previously, he served on the Court of Appeals in Georgia and as a Superior Court judge. He also founded a drug court program and was the presiding judge there. But he wears a hat, too, in addition to his judicial hat. And he was also a state representative in Georgia. So he knows the role of policy and legislation and brings that to this role as well. And importantly for this conversation, Justice Boggs was a member of the Georgia Criminal Justice Reform Council and served as its co-chair for several years. And for anyone who watched the changes that were made, the justice reform, justice reinvestment changes in the country, so many of us looked at Georgia and what they were able to accomplish there, and this council was a big part of that. Topeka Sam is next. Topeka is the founder and executive director of the Ladies of Hope Ministries and the co-founder of Hope House New York City. And I just told Topeka, I was looking at her bio, and I can't begin to describe all the roles she plays. She wears so many hats that it is head-spinning. But one thing I want to draw out about Topeka is just how much hope she brings people around the country. Since her release, not only has Topeka been a personal inspiration to people, but she has been, really influencing the policy debate in nationally, federally, and in so many localities as well. And everywhere she goes, every room she goes in, she digs up her sleeves and she gets really substantive and helpful and constructive. And we really appreciate her role. Topeka also is focused in particular on dignity, decriminalization, and decarceration of women and girls. And she's focused particularly on probation and parole. And when she was a Soros Fellow, she developed the Probation and Parole Accountability Project. And I know we'll hear some about that today. And last but not least is Marc Levin, who's the Vice President of Criminal Justice at the Texas Public Policy Foundation and Right on Crime. And Marc really started the foundation's focus on criminal justice in 2005 and has a lot of responsibility for the reforms that took place in Texas. Marc also was the architect of the Right on Crime movement, which has become such a the go-to place for conservative criminal justice reforms. And Marc is certainly, I think, one of the most prolific people that any of us who know him know. And in this specific area of probation parole, he and his colleagues are writing briefs and reports that are really informing what's going on in Texas and what can happen there, as well as many other states around the country. So it's a fantastic panel, and we're really looking forward to the conversation. And just before we dig in with these questions, just a quick observation. This morning, the conversation today felt to me different from even the conversation last year, and I felt like we moved from talking about less system, less tearing down, and more towards what do we want to build? What does it look like? And I hope that we're going to feel have some of that conversation in this room too. One thing that struck me coming into this panel is we did a similar panel last year, and Jake Horowitz from Pew and I talked about community supervision, and Arnold and Pew put out a report, and we characterized it as being overlooked and understudied, and how it was a really important part of criminal justice reform, but it was totally under the radar. And that does not feel like the case 1 year later. And I was trying to think about why. And I think that one reason is Meek Mill. We have a person, a human story, and a person with a lot of people who pay attention to him, who really made this real and brought his human story to it and kind of shone a bright light on some of the injustices in a way that no data report is ever going to do. I think about the way that the chiefs and current chiefs are stepping up with their own vision of what reform looks like, and that feels different and exciting. And I know we're going to hear about that some more from Vinnie and from Erica. And a third part that I think is really important is we have data. And if you could put the slide up. I think we only have one slide for this whole panel. But last year, yeah, this is it. But last year we talked about how there was a lot of failure on supervision, and it was our sense that it was driving some of prison admissions, but we only had data from a handful of states, and we couldn't distinguish whether it was new crimes or technical violations that were, a part of this. And the Council of State Governments Justice Center, in less than a year, put together a comprehensive 50-state report that shows us at the national level and state by state the extent to which revocations on probation and parole are driving prison admissions. And as you can see here, 45% of state prison admissions are driven by failures on probation and parole. It costs taxpayers $9 billion a year. And when you look just at technical violations and technical revocations, it's a quarter of people coming in the front door of prisons are for technical violations, costing taxpayers about $2.8 billion a year. And there's a lot of state variation, and that data is available. And I think it's just a real wake-up call, a concrete way to say how important this issue is if we want to do something about mass incarceration. And the last thing is there's just so much activity in this space. We released last year a challenge, an RFP, because there were not many organizations doing work in this space. And now I feel like we got bold, exciting ideas from all over the country, from organizations and agencies that want to do things better, and it's just exciting to see this kind of activity underway. And so with that, we're going to launch into more detail here, but I'm just encouraged at what we're seeing and how much fire there is right now to make some change. So Erica, for those people who aren't as close to this issue, can you describe a little bit what probation, like business as usual, looks like in a lot of places? And I'm going to give you this.
Thank you, Amy. One of the things that I just ground myself first is to say that In Multnomah County, we believe that our vision is community safety through positive change. So my core value was that people can change. And what we believe is that when we help an individual change their lives, that we restore a family, that we build stronger communities. And so we take our role in this work very seriously. And as we're talking about probation and parole, I want to give a little bit of context about where I come from. I come from Multnomah County. We are the smallest landmass in Oregon, but we have the biggest urban population. I have 600 employees, 130 of those which are probation parole officers. They work with both probationers and parolees. They're optionally armed, and they can administratively sanction. And where our adjudicating authority is our Board of County Commissioners. So I just think it's important to set context before I start talking so people can understand the lens that I see the world through. For us, when we look at probation as usual for us really looks like really burdening our justice-involved individuals with unnecessary conditions that oftentimes are not related to what's going on with them as far as their actual risk and need. Probation as usual is probation and parole officers not taking the time to really understand what a person needs to really change their behavior. So, doing conditions monitoring, just making sure that they're monitoring the conditions so that they can satisfy the adjudicating authority. So I think that those are some of the dangers. And we have been very intentional in Multnomah County to really put in strategies and give our officers tools so that we don't do that. Probation as usual is keeping people on supervision as long until their expiration date and not looking for alternatives when they've met their goals, getting them off supervision so they can go back and live freely in their communities. And so one of the things from a national perspective that I'm really inspired by is just recently I am now the past president of the American Probation Parole Association. I had my last conference in San Francisco. How many people were in San Francisco? Woohoo! We got to get more people there. We'll get more people to New Orleans in the winter. So one of the things that we did, we had an inaugural executive summit in March of 2019. And at that executive summit, there was a lot of people in the room that come from multiple different perspectives when it comes to this work. And one of the things that we really strongly understood is that we're suffering from an identity crisis in our profession, and that there's so many people doing this work in so many different ways, whose adjudicated authority is different. And really the hope when we left that room is that we need to come together around a set of standards about how we all do this work. We talked about really what our heart is for the work and really going from that whole idea of, and I'm going to quote Dr. Brian Levins. I don't know how many people are familiar with Dr. Brian Levins. Going from a referee to really being a coach, someone that's that doesn't just monitor conditions, but helps people and guides them so that they can change their behavior. So, when I think about community safety, and this is my last comment that I'll say, is that when you talk about community supervision, we have a multiplying effect and we have a long-term impact on public safety. And that's something when we do it right, we keep our community safe in the long term, and we bring people back into the community so they can help our communities grow stronger.
Great, thank you. And Vinnie, if you can talk about what reform looks like, and certainly talk about some of the exit.
Sure. So, hi everybody. I want to just do a little backup and do some background before I get into reform. This all started in the mid-1800s. It was very overtly an act of mercy and redemption and rehabilitation, both probation and parole. To be sure, it was also an act of social control, but it really led with mercy and tempering justice with some ability to have some other kind of something else other than the stocks and incarceration. And that ran smack into the war on crime and the war on drugs and the advent of mass incarceration. And I think most of us understand that better through the incarceration lens than through the probation and parole lens. So part of it that's still a well-kept secret, I think, is that part. So, you know, when nothing works became the mantra, we all, you know, prisons had something to fall back on. They could be punitive, they could be incapacitative, they were a deterrent. Probation and parole pretty much had nothing, right? All we were rehabilitation. And if that didn't work, what were we? So we pivoted and we became community corrections. You'd be a fool to have done otherwise as a commissioner when everybody was saying nothing works. To lead with, oh no, these are, you know, people that are, you know, sort of beset by issues of poverty and racism and we need to help them was not the way to go. You wanted to be a community corrections administrator. You wanted to put electronic monitors on people and open boot camps. You wanted to pack guns. You wanted to wear clothes that looked a lot more like cops. You wanted to kick in doors. You wanted to look through underwear drawers, right? That's what we did. And that sort of sucked. And especially for a bunch of commissioners and a bunch of staff who went into it hoping to rehabilitate people. So people got like super depressed. Some people left. A lot of people joined that were, you know, more cop-like and wanted to kick in doors and search through underwear drawers, but there was no room in the police department, so they were going to do that thing. And this all happened during enormous social forces. You know, factories were moving overseas, the social safety net was disappearing. So now you're a probation officer or parole officer, your caseloads are mushrooming, resources are not following that increase, either with staff or with stuff to do with people. And the environments became increasingly risk averse. You know, Willie Horton and his progeny, everybody was fearful that their guy would be that guy. And you had to do this math as an individual. And that math was, look, I could take a chance on this guy and he could live a happy, healthy, productive life, or gal, and I get nothing for that. But if he goes out and reoffends, I could lose my job, I could get transferred to a lousy location, I could get screamed at by my boss, and I also just look like a fool in front of all my colleagues. So that set up a situation where only heroes, and there were heroes, right, were doing the risk non-averse thing and keeping those folks in the communities, and that's where we get that graph from. So that's sort of, I think, important to know how we got that graph from. But there was a tremendous amount of dissonance in folks in the field. Now I'm really talking as an insider, right? Because it sucked for people on probation and parole too. I'm leaving that to you, right? But I'm talking like a commissioner now who walked in. I mean, 6 people committed suicide with guns in my department after my predecessor allowed them to have guns. That, like, my staff when I started were talking about a suicide rate in a department of 1,000 people. You shouldn't be talking about a suicide rate, right? And so it was really dissonant for folks in the field. Not all of them. Some of them were sadistic bastards, and you're going to find that any place you go, but most of them. And now we're at a point, and frankly, I didn't know that before I went in. You know, I was an outsider, and I thought you guys were all, you know, like you loved this stuff, or you didn't care about it. Really, I did. And I bet there are people in this room that think that too. And I found that that wasn't true. I found that there were a lot of people in the field that hated what had happened to the field. And, you know, they were trying stuff, to be sure, evidence-based practices, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, other people can talk about that too. I'm not talking about evidence-based practices today. But people were trying stuff, but still, overall, those forces are really, really difficult to push back on. And now, as a team, as a group, we're pushing back on them. So we formed this group called EXIT, Executives Transforming Probation and Parole, 70 current and former probation and parole commissioners who are saying you shouldn't lock people up for technical violations, literally no technical violations. You shouldn't fine people and charge them fees to be on probation and parole. A whole bunch of people who are on probation and parole shouldn't be on probation and parole. People get on it, shouldn't be on for as long. We should incentivize good behavior by letting people off early when they don't mess up. Bunch of stuff like that. And then we should capture some of those savings and put them into the kinds of things that are going to help people thrive in their communities. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you. And we're actually going to go all the way down right now to Marc. You're on. I want to know how these reforms resonate with conservatives.
Well, They do, and limited government, right? I mean, that's individual liberty. These are things that we're talking about here today, and the intrusion we make into somebody's life should be no greater than necessary to address the public safety issue. And frankly, there's people on probation that shouldn't even be there, as Vinnie said. They're not a danger to public safety, and we keep people on much too long. There's states like Nebraska where there's people on lifetime probation or parole. So there's so much here for, I think, people, regardless of where you are on the spectrum, to dig in and say, we need to right-size this, and actually, therefore, we will have the resources to better assist and supervise those people that truly do need to be on supervision. And I think one of the things that's really quite interesting is, and this gets to one of the issues that was addressed in Travis County, which is Austin, but one of the prior probation directors realized we've got something called Fortress Probation, one central office in downtown of a city, and people on probation who live 20, 30 miles away. So let's have probation officers who serve those neighborhoods. And I know in Georgia, your parole officers now don't even have an office. They visit folks operating out of their cars. So it's actually, especially now with automation, all the technology, let's have the face-to-face contact really be meaningful instead of whether it's the probationer or the probation officer spending a lot of time sitting in an office or having to go get to an office for an appointment. So, but I think the other aspect of this fortress probation concept that's really can appeal to people, again, on all sides is the answer isn't only in government. And if you look at the wages program in Colorado, the Colorado Department of Corrections, some money was taken out of their budget, they eventually agreed to it, and was put into this. It's basically a one-stop center in Denver, and it's people that are formerly incarcerated, people that have been on supervision, providing mentoring, vocational training. Folks can come there who are on supervision or who just got out of prison, and they can, get on a computer, they can have peer mentoring and so forth. So I think one of the problems we have is if we depend solely on kind of government personnel, I mean, what person on probation wants to tell their probation officer, I'm having a bad week or I might relapse? We ought to be providing things like peer support, true therapeutic, interventions. Those ought to be coming from other sources, not be dependent on the probation officer or parole officer. And, it gets back to, is this going to be a tripwire for failure, or are we going to reward success? There's a famous old sign on a parole office in California that said, trail them, nail them, and jail them. And I think now we're finally beginning to say, no, let's help people succeed. And, any conservative would say we want to measure the effectiveness of a welfare program by how we're getting people off of welfare. Well, why would we want to measure probation by how many people are under supervision? We ought to be getting people off who don't need this anymore. And so that's why early termination, earned time, a lot of jurisdictions are embracing that. So I think, most people on the right, when you ask about government, they say we should streamline it. It should be smaller, less intrusive. So why would we be afraid to apply that to this area?
Great. Thank you. And Topeka, you can hold on to that mic.
Okay.
I want to get your perspective on this, and just thinking about with the Meek Mill example, part of this was humanizing this issue and putting human story behind it. And part of it also is having someone who has been a part of the system, being part of the solution, helping really craft the reforms that they think would be helpful. And I know in both those cases, you've been a role model. So just can you speak to this?
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon. I don't even know what time it is, but hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I think I would start by, Veronica, you said that, you believe people can change. And the way that I approach just life is like, I am the change. So I am that change that I want to see, right? And so that more people who have been incarcerated, impacted by the criminal legal system, are actually stepping forward now, using their voice to try to make these changes. I remember when I started or thought about the Soros Justice Fellowship, when I was on federal supervision at the time, and I was going through all these issues when I opened Hope House, and they were like, not in our backyard. And then one of the neighbors called my probation officer and said, felons aren't supposed to be fraternizing with each other. It was like all this mess, but my probation officer knew the work that I was doing, and we had went through this whole issue. Like, I was taking her to court back and forth, making sure that I would be able to travel to do the work that I was doing, because things change, as everyone knows, from one probation officer to another probation officer. And then finally, the judge, the first time I went in for early termination for sentence, because federally, after your first year of completion, you can put it in, the judge told me no, and they were like, I wasn't doing anything extraordinary, and my lawyer was like, well, if she isn't, who is? And then I waited a year, because he denied it without prejudice, but I was able to reapply. And at that time, it was just that I realized I wasn't the only one going through it, and that there were so many people around the country who were on supervision, did 20 years in prison, and then given a life sentence of probation. People like, I've been home for 27 years and I'm still on probation. And I'm saying, all right, well, from my understanding, probation was a sentence that's supposed to be in lieu of incarceration, and yet it's being used as a double sentence. And so how do we begin to inform and use our voices in order to talk about the things that we're experiencing so that we can change what's happening? And so when I did the Soros Fellowship, I remember it was the American Probation and Parole Association's anniversary, I think it was an anniversary, and I had wrote an op-ed that I wasn't going to celebrate the American Probation and Parole Association because I was like, I'm not doing this, and they're not helping us, so basically later for them. And then, I looked over a year later, and then here I am working with the American Probation and Parole Association to make sure that we're working collaboratively in order to understand what needs to happen and needs to change, because it's not one-sided, right? Like, we all have to come to the table and come to the work together in order to really create solutions that are helping people who are under surveillance. But we can't keep just doing the work in silos. It can't be just that one person. It's great that Meek came out because he has the influence, and he has, rich friends who were able to put money and support behind him. But even in that, when you're building organizations and you don't have formerly incarcerated leadership in high-level positions, then who's really the decision makers? And so, for me, it's making sure that as we are moving in these spaces and we're working collaboratively with all of these different organizations or agencies, that we are making sure that we are also at the table, and not just to tell our story, because so people will feel bad for us, but also that we're lending our story so that we can really make some substantial policy changes.
Great. Thank you. So we're talking about the importance of different perspectives at the table, especially when we're crafting policy and reforms. And the judicial perspective often carries a lot of weight. And Justice Boggs, can you talk to us about the perspective of the judge?
Sure, now I understand why you put us in this order. So, good afternoon, everyone. Let me give you a little history about me that would help inform my conversation with you. So I previously served as a state legislator in Georgia about 20 years ago. I've been on the bench in a number of capacities. I've presided over probably 3,000 to 5,000 felony sentences, felony probation revocation cases. I have served not only as a trial judge, where I developed and presided over our first felony drug court program, but also as an appellate court judge on Georgia's Intermediate Appellate Court, and now as a justice on the Georgia Supreme Court. So I've seen this sort of reformative thought process affect the judiciary from a number of perspectives, but also for a number of years. And so judges, of course, come from a different perspective. It was interesting to hear the academic sort of history about how probation really started. I will tell you. Yeah, academic perspective. Or I should have said intellectual perspective. So there's, a judge. So at first, the conversation implicates the role of a judge, and there are different opinions about the role that a judge, he or she, should take in any criminal justice setting. We have approximately 213 Superior Court judges which preside over felony cases in Georgia, 159 counties. We also lead the nation in the number of people that are on probation per capita, right? So on average, about 1,500 people, 1,568 I think is the number, per 100,000 adults are on some form of community supervision. In Georgia, the number is 6,161. We have the longest sentences, we have more split sentences, and we therefore have more people on community supervision. The real role, the question you have to ask when judges look at the purposes of probation is, what is the judge trying to accomplish? But the judge has multiple considerations. We're not a unified court system in our state, and so unlike the adjudicative authority being the county, in the state, it's the judge. And the judge, however, hears from the county commission about cost on probation revocationers sitting in a county jail waiting on a probation revocation hearing. They hear from victims about accountability and the slow process of the judicial system. They hear from prosecutors about the need to adjudicate this case in a particular way. They hear from defense lawyers about the need to adjudicate a case in a particular way. You know that approximately 97% of every sentence imposed by a trial court judge is an agreement to a plea offer recommended by the prosecuting attorney that the judge can't change generally. So understand that somehow your hands are quite a bit tied. I will just say that the perspective that I glean from my conversations across the country with trial court judges and in my own state and my own personal experience was that probation was largely ineffective to achieve the results that I wanted achieved, which was some form of an accountability, some punishment, right? It's not the most significant punishment, incapacitation, but there ought to be some accountability. Unfortunately, we also, like many states in our state, have multiple general conditions of probation that are statutorily codified in every single case. So when you mentioned avoiding other people that were on probation, I saw a couple people's eyes light up. In Georgia, you are to avoid people or places of disreputable or harmful character. Now, you can all define what that means. I've had several people ask me. I'm not sure what that means. Right. But it is a general condition of probation in Georgia. You are not to consume alcohol, even though you may not have an alcohol problem. You can't go into places where alcohol is served. That's every Ruby Tuesdays and every restaurant probably imaginable. So the judicial perspective, and then you add overlaid on top of that in many instances judges are elected. And so when you talk about judges trying to make sure they do the right thing, and you mentioned Willie Horton, the judge doesn't want that guy to be his guy either. Yep. The judge doesn't want that guy that you've put on probation but you haven't given a lot of conditions that does something really bad. You're ultimately going to be the one that a finger is pointed at to have been responsible. So the fortunate part is that the role of a judge, I think frankly, has been informed by and improved by the successes of criminal justice reform over the last 7 or 8 years through different jurisdictions. You know, it used to be that you would ask a judge, well, why don't you develop a drug court program, or why don't you consider not imposing all of those conditions or not imposing any special conditions of probation? And oftentimes I would hear, I'm not a social worker. My job as a judge is not to remediate behavior. My job as a judge is to interpret the law and apply it fairly and equally across the board in my job. So this referee sort of concept. And so judges come from a different perspective, but I think by and large most of them now understand that there is a role to reform and remediate and help and assist. And so now you've seen the judges now, I think, being more actively involved not only in the process of criminal justice reform efforts across the United States, but even individually in their own silos, developing drug court programs and trying to do the things that address the drivers of the conduct to help people stay out of the system. Because another concern that judges have are enormous caseloads, very limited resources. The entire state of Georgia judicial budget is less than 0.1% of the entire state budget. 0.1%. And so when we've got 6 counties like I had as a trial judge, and you're presiding over thousands of cases a year, trying to handle divorces and trying to handle car wreck cases and personal injury cases, and this day you're handling probation revocation cases, it's very difficult to handle those sorts of enormous caseloads. So there's a bit of self-importance involved in it, but there's also a bit of self-satisfaction knowing that you're helping your caseload in addition to helping these citizens that are justice involved that are coming in front of you. So the judicial perspective is different. But please understand it really stems from what do you view as the role of a judge. And every judge doesn't view their role the same way. And so fortunately, I think successful criminal justice reform efforts have shed a new light, I think, on the judges that I know and about how they approach their jobs generally.
Great. Thank you. We are going to shift now to some of the lessons from the states that have experimented with different reforms. I want to say for folks in the back, there's lots of front row seats, so feel free to come on up. And Vinnie is going to start with the tale of two New Yorks.
Okay, that was great. So about a year and a half ago, after Meek Mill was, the case became highly publicized, Van Jones reached out to me and we started collaborating on a bunch of stuff. And one of the things we did was some studies about probation and parole nationally, probation and parole in Pennsylvania, probation and parole in New York, and Wisconsin. We did that together with Just Leadership. And so in looking at New York, learned that New York, just looking at parole, had the second highest number of people being sent to prison for technical violations in the country, and that as the numbers at Rikers Island were plummeting, and they had plummeted by more than 2/3 now, about 22,000 down to 7,000. It's not a well-known story either, and New York is not just a very safe place, but a very reduced incarceration place, has the lowest incarceration rate of any big city in the country. The only population going up, and going up by double digits, was people locked up for technical parole violations who were sitting and waiting for their hearings. That cost about $138 million in New York last year, and the 6,000+ people that were sent to prison for technicals at the state level cost over $300 million. That's like, even in New York, where apartments are really expensive, that's real money, right? And during that time, the number of people paroled, released from prison into homeless shelters in New York doubled. So it went from about 2,000 to 4,000. And actually, if you think about the 4,000, like 4,300, and the number of people on technicals that roll through Rikers, it's pretty damn near the same number. So we're a society, as rich as we are, that is finding the money to lock people up for non-criminal violations of their parole, but not finding the money to house them when they come out of parole. And I've never talked to somebody on parole who said that homeless shelters are a place you go to do anything but fail. Meanwhile, in the same exact city, with the same amount of rain and the same market forces going up and down and the same unemployment rates and the same hospital system, we have the city's probation department, which is a local function. There, we've gone from having about 70,000 people on probation in the mid-90s to about 25,000 people on probation now, so very dramatic drop. It has not been a jailbreak. Those people that used to be on probation are not pillaging and plundering the city. Crime is down by like 2/3. Homicides are down from 2,200 to 200 and change.
This one
It's a New York
deserves a
miracle.
graph. Let me just say that we only had one, but that one,
Yeah. And the length of time on probation is declining. Technical violations hover between 3% and 4%. They're 29% for people on parole in the same city. They're 11% in the rest of the state. The department's taken that money, put it into tons of community programs, has opened up 14 neighborhood offices. So instead of like these big fortress-like places like Marc mentioned, you go to a small neighborhood office that's often co-located with or sometimes co-located in a nonprofit organization. Like in West Harlem, you're in a Fortune Society. In Staten Island, you're in a YMCA, literally. That's where you go see your PO. And so right in the same city, you see this really dramatic, different approach to how to handle people under community supervision. Now, let's be real. People on parole generally have done more serious stuff. That's why they went to prison instead of getting probation. But the number of people convicted of felonies in New York that get probation is a super low number. So it's not like everybody's getting probation, and almost nobody's on probation in New York for a misdemeanor. So it's not like probation is dealing with a bunch of lightweights. And they're managing essentially to almost completely eschew revocations and to basically capture that money to use it to help people turn their lives around. Could the probation department do more? Absolutely. Could we communitize that more? I think we could. But it's just pretty remarkable to see two wildly different approaches without, frankly, wildly different crime outcomes. It's not like parole is making us a lot safer and probation's being sort of a frivolous release mechanism to allow people to go do harm.
can you speak to how the city got the revocation rate so low?
It was, I think in part, New York has increasingly had a culture of utilizing the criminal justice system less to solve social problems, which is kind of part and parcel of the decline in the number of people that are incarcerated. When I was commissioner, we actually had $1 million in my budget to receive people who we thought we'd get because the Rockefeller drug laws had been reformed a year before I got here. And we got almost nobody additional. When I looked at the data and talked to the DAs, it's because they already were working around the Rockefeller drug laws. So they already were sort of taking people who were busted for more than an ounce of cocaine and charging them with something that wouldn't kick the mandatory in. So literally, if you look at a chart, when you would never know when the Rockefeller drug laws occurred. And I think that's reflective of what was happening in New York. New York's courts are doing, ironically, what Marc suggested. A big increase in conditional discharges, unconditional discharges, a massive informalization of the system, and adjournment and contemplation of dismissal, which is as close to nothing as you could get. That's what Meek Mill got for his popping a wheelie, right, while he was on probation. And so folks are getting massively informalized. The department itself has gotten much smaller, and it's captured a lot of those money. The cool thing is, even though the department's budget has gone down since the mid-90s to now, because the number of people on probation has gone down so much more, Mike Jacobson and I and Reagan Daly and Emily Hotez did a paper when we were on an executive session at Harvard that showed that just to burnish my academic credentials, that I had to drop the Harvard thing in there, you know, that the costs per person on probation had gone up, and that those resources were being used for smaller caseloads and for more programs for people to help them, thrive.
Great, thanks. And Marc, if you can pick up a mic down there. As I understand it, Texas has a little bit of the reverse, where their policy changes made at the state level that impacted parole revocations, and that there are opportunities for county probation. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, in Texas, it's very interesting. So parole is a statewide function, whereas probation, 120 departments across the state, and the elected judges hire the probation director. So bottom line is, and we elect our judges in partisan elections, the probation revocation process is much more subject to kind of political influences through that than you have appointed parole board members who no one really pays much attention to. They're deciding whether someone's revoked from parole and whether people are released from prison onto parole. So the key with parole, I think, in Texas, going back to our justice reinvestment effort in 2007, was first of all budgetary. We said we set a limit, 75 people on parole per officer, and I really believe there's evidence that whether you're talking about probation or parole supervision, if the officer feels overwhelmed because their docket is so large, they're more likely to throw their hands up and refer someone to be revoked. And I think part of what bears that out is in Texas, about half of our probation revocations are people that are classified as absconders. Now you could debate whether, how long does someone have to be not reporting to be an absconder, but the reality is, and frankly, we ought to be doing things like, apps and text messaging to make it easier for people to report. A lot of times it's people that, they have, they're trying to take care of their children, hold a few jobs, so not everyone is intentionally absconding that misses probation appointments. But nonetheless, that's a problem. Generally, supervision agencies will say, as long as we can keep working with someone, most of them will say, let's try to find a way. And of course, that leads to the other thing we did on parole was graduated sanctions, as well as more use of positive incentives, which I think actually are even more effective based on the research. So the idea is, of course, first try all these different things before you go to incarceration. And even after you've done all these graduated sanctions, send someone to an intermediate sanctions facility for 60 or 90 days versus sending them back to prison for the remainder of their sentence, which could be 10, 15, 20 years. Now, and I also want to say it's important to apply this not just to technical violations, but to misdemeanors as well. As Vinnie alluded to, marijuana, in Texas, that's still a misdemeanor. We had someone who Rick Perry commuted when he was governor who got revoked to prison for 40 years for smoking marijuana while he was on probation. And again, thankfully the governor commuted that. But so there's a lot of challenges there. Now, looking forward, what we're trying to address with probation is some departments have made great strides, but others are still revoking a lot of people for technical violations. We have 12,000 annual technical revocations from probation in Texas. That's like 4 or 5 prisons. So what we can do is certainly say you have to exhaust all these alternatives before you revoke someone for technical violations. I don't think politically we're going to be able to get rid of them completely. But certainly, the other thing is, I think, targeting specific populations. I think, you alluded to this, the judges are becoming more sensitive to the needs of people that come before them, whether you have a mental health problem, an addiction, people who are disabled, emerging adults. That's a stunning number. In Texas, people that are 17 to 25, unfortunately 17-year-olds are still considered adults in Texas, criminal justice, but 17 to 25, in a lot of our departments, that's half of the revocations, and it's a quarter of the people on probation. So we've got to have developmentally appropriate supports for these individuals. Some of them could even go back to high school voluntarily, but yet we're saying you have to have a job and pay all these probation fees of $60 a month, which doesn't sound like a lot to you and me, but again, that gets in the way of a lot of probation officers report they're spending so much time trying to collect fees, they're not really focusing on the criminogenic issues. So we're moving hopefully to also cap how long people will be revoked when they do go back to prison. And then finally, on incentive funding, we're trying to change the way we fund probation. We're funding our probation departments based on how many people they have on probation, when we should be looking at outcomes, reducing recidivism, employment numbers. So that is a big one. And if we are going to do part of it based on how many people are on your caseload, say we're going to front load it for the first 2 years. And as these folks continue to keep these people on probation for 5-10 years, your funding per person is going to go down. So we're going to build in an incentive to have the kind of more streamlined system we've all been talking about today.
Thank you, and I know you have evidence from earlier in Texas from a county or two, and California does too, that shows that can really incentivize counties to keep people in the communities instead of sending them to prison and jail.
Yeah, absolutely. And then on the incentive funding side in the juvenile system, y'all are probably familiar with Reclaim Ohio, Redeploy Illinois, which actually does have some pilot counties in Illinois doing the adult probation incentive funding. But it's basically if these counties send fewer people to the state, reduce their failure levels on probation, they can get a share of those savings back to invest in the kind of things Vinnie was talking about.
And Justice Boggs, can you talk to us about the legislation that passed in, I think it's 17 and 18 in Georgia?
Yeah, so Georgia, as I suggested, was leading the nation in the number of people that were on probation supervision. Most interestingly to me, the length of period of supervision was over 10 years. You all know, right, that's driven in large part by pleas, which I just indicated a moment ago was driven by the prosecutor. But a lot of people don't know, and I'm sure this crowd does, but many people didn't recognize that for those 10 years, they were carrying not only a Fourth Amendment waiver, which allowed the search of the drawer without a warrant and probable cause sufficient to sustain the warrant, but also had a lower standard of proof on a new offense. So if a probationer got arrested for popping a wheelie or whatever it might be, you could revoke their probation for that new offense without finding them guilty of the new offense beyond a reasonable doubt. Those hooks that prosecutors really like to leave into people left some really long probation sentences. And so with the assistance of the Council of State Government's Justice Center, who came in and provided technical assistance to Georgia in 2017, Georgia passed Senate Bill 174. We did a couple of things. The first goal, of course, was to try to reduce in a responsible way the number of individuals that were on felony probation. We had each felony probation officer in our state had a caseload of about 140 people under their supervision. If you can imagine trying to manage, supervise, and provide resources to 140 people. And so we started with creating the Department of Community Supervision, where instead of the Department of Corrections handling all the probation supervision, it's now going to be housed in one agency, the Department of Community Supervision. But we incentivized behavior. So one thing that we did in the legislation was that we said, okay, we recognize the evidence that is fairly empirical that suggests that the likelihood of recidivism is highest in the first 2 years, and so we front-loaded services. The second thing we recognized is that a lot of people were not off probation because they owed money. And as long as you owe money, they're not going to let the hook off it, right? So what we did is we said, but for restitution, if you've paid everything but restitution, or you've paid restitution but you still owe fines and fees, you can move to a non-reporting status, which is a quick way to get them off of probation. And so we incentivized behavior by imposing a behavior incentive date. We now require judges in most offenses to provide a date by which, if you are compliant, you can be released from probation that is no more than 3 years from the date you are first sentenced. The other thing we did, which we found was interesting, in my years as a Superior Court judge, I can't think of more than 10 instances where a justice-involved individual who was on probation for a felony ever came back to my court with a petition for early termination. We had statutory authority allowing this individual to do that. But if you're compliant, you don't want to re-engage with the judge and with the prosecutor. And so what we did is we put the burden on the new Department of Community Supervision for early terminations and said, if the individual has paid their money, they paid the restitution, but the other money's not been paid, you can now ask for early termination. And just to give you a quick stat, which I've just received, about how well that's working, it just was enacted in 17, became effective in July of 17. So from July of 17 through June of this year, 21,000 petitions have been submitted to judges by the department on behalf of these justice-involved probationers, and 83% of them have been granted. 40,000 people have been removed from the probation rolls, not because they did anything other than be compliant. The onus was on the department to do it on their behalf. And interestingly, the average sentence saved for each of these individuals was 6.5 years of probation. 6.5 years of probation. So behavior incentive dates to incentivize front-loading services to make sure that we address the needs on the front end rather than on the back end, and then early termination onus on the department versus on the defendant, so that you would have a means by which to get these people back into communities without these Fourth Amendment waivers and lower standards of proof hanging over their head for what would have now been an extra 6 or 7 years. So
That is compelling. Those numbers are really scale numbers. Is there going to be any kind of publicness of these numbers so other folks can take a look at the legislation?
Yeah, I think so. To my knowledge, these numbers were produced at my request, and there's no report. I think they're worthy of a report. We did some parole reform as well. We have a constitutional parole board, and the parole board, we've seen a 35% decline in parole revocations over the last several years because we're now front-loading services for those individuals as well. So, yeah, I think we'll try to see that information. Senate Bill 174 is online. You can go online and read that. You can also go to the Department of Community Supervision in Georgia, their website, and there's a drop-down menu that contains the Council on Criminal Justice Reform reports that I helped write, and the 17 report outlines all of these measures.
That's great. And I should say that we have some electronic resources that CAP is putting up on the website for the conference, so you'll be able to access some of the things that we're referencing afterwards if you're interested. I'm going to turn back to Erica and ask the same question I asked Vinnie. Multnomah County has a really, really, really low revocation rate. I think that it's 1% of your population. Is that right?
Yep.
Can you speak to how you got there?
So first of all, I want to just go back to, I started this talking about probation as usual, and I really want to also say that there's so many jurisdictions trying to do the right things for the right reasons, and we know that there's a lot of challenges and barriers that we need to overcome. And in Multnomah County, we really have examined our jail bed use. We've looked at our revocation rates, and I think the word that I would use is really intentionality. We've been very intentional about working with our probation and parole officers around effective sanctioning practices, so that person that does go on abscond, that when they come back from abscond, it's not an automatic 30 days. Does it have to be 30 days? What were they doing in the community? Could it be 2? Could it be 3? So we've been very, very aggressive in creating a grid that only allows 3 days for technical violations, if that. If our officers are coming to their supervisors with 10 or 15-day jail sanctions, the supervisors are trained to ask, why not do it for 3? And after you do it for 3 days, and then what? What's the next thing? Really focusing on those case plan goals and really trying to get to that behavior change. We've given revocation guidelines that say, you can revoke for these reasons, and here are our revocation thresholds, and so we've been very good about just really putting some controls on that. And the other thing is that we have a jail that has limited capacity, and with that, we have to be very clear about our jail bed use, and we're also very committed to saying jail does not work to change behavior. So if you're trying to change behavior, don't put someone in jail. If you're trying to protect the community because someone's at risk, then that might be appropriate use for jail. So those are some of the ways that we've done that. And we've done some other things to try to keep people out of jail. And so Vinnie talked about evidence-based practices. I'm not going to talk about evidence-based practices either, but I'm going to talk about some overlays that we've done that have been innovative and that we're measuring right now. We got a SMART grant that allowed us to be able to overlay over our case management model, which is EPICS, Effective Practices in Community Supervision. We were able to overlay trauma-informed tools, pay attention to brain development, as well as look at things through a culturally responsive lens. And what we found in doing that with a very targeted group of justice-involved individuals, our 18 to 25-year-olds, is that we were able to reduce our jail use, that our justice-involved individuals were having a more positive experience in supervision, and that our officers were having a more positive experience in supervision. So I know we're running short on time, but those are some of the things that we've done in Multnomah County.
I hope one thing that you're hearing here is that there are lots of ways to affect change in probation and parole agencies. Some of this is state legislative, some is executive policy at the state level, and some happens in the counties and within the departments. And the last couple examples we heard, or the last example at least, this is a county agency that's made decisions about how to do things differently. And so I want to quickly announce we're so excited. We've been working with the Institute for State and Local Governance, Michael Jacobson and Reagan Daly and Victoria, who is, I believe, in the room here, Victoria Lawson. And we've been working with them on organizations and jurisdictions that want to work together, their probation leadership and research partners, to really unpack what's going on with revocations and design strategies to reduce them greatly. So today we're announcing 10 jurisdictions, which are action research teams of probation, leadership, and research partners to spend some time unpacking what's driving revocations in their locality and trying to prevent them. And we really hope that these jurisdictions are going to have lessons not only to drive down their own revocation rates, but for the rest of the country. And is there anyone in the room that's in one of these sites? Yeah, we have a few sites. Congratulations. We have big counties, Harris County, Cook County. We have small counties, Niagara, New York, and Monroe County, Indiana, Denver, Pima, Pulaski, Arizona, Ramsey County, Spokane, and Santa Cruz. And I know some of these counties are in the room, so we're really excited and hope we'll be able to learn from that over the next few months and year. And I want to turn now to, we're going to go to Q&A soon, but Topeka, and just ask you about what is going on that's promising. What do you see for probation parole reforms when it comes to women?
Well, I know what Erica is doing, is doing some incredible work in Oregon. There are many other jurisdictions that I've been privy to in Ohio, just in San Diego. Recently, I just went there. Actually, yesterday, I was in San Diego. In New York, we've been working with some of the probation offices to work on a gender-responsive lens from women who've actually been on probation and parole themselves. And also with Dr. Levin, we were talking about how do we create a program where it is peer navigators, but they're actually paid to work within probation offices until we're able to get formerly incarcerated or people who've been on probation as officers, because I think that also needs to change the culture once we're able to also come in there. So outside of it just being, women informed, but I think us informed, those who've actually lived that experience. If we're not actually working these jobs, working these systems alongside of the other people, then it's still gonna fall short. And I just want to add that we didn't talk much about parole reform. Everything has been heavily talked about on probation. There's been incredible probation reforms, but there's still a lot that has to happen around parole reforms. So maybe could be some Q&A. I'm gonna stop there. But I know that we have to do a lot better in that area as well.
Great, thanks. So we're going to do a very brief look at what's ahead, particularly resources that are coming out that we want you to be aware of. And 3 of our panelists here were part of an advisory group working with Pew and Arnold Ventures, developing policy framework for community corrections. And Justice Boggs and Topeka and Erica have all been a part of that process. So they're going to just touch briefly. I think Justice Boggs is going to start on what's coming out and when.
So Pew is taking a look at remediating some of these measures in a way that addresses, for example, legal financial obligations and reform around how might we mitigate some of the burdens that are placed on these individuals by virtue of the fines and fees that they're required to pay. The considerations of ensuring that the conditions of probation, right, are more attuned to and individualized to the individuals that are on probation. In the end of the day, you should know that this resource will, we hope, be a resource for all of you about what kind of best practices and thought processes are out there relative to how you and your state might remediate some really antiquated, probably, probation systems in your state. You can look at what other states like Texas and Georgia and other states have done, but this will be more of a high-level collaborative sort of stakeholder approach to some real specifics that might address some matters that would resonate in your particular community. So with that, Amy, I'm happy to let others talk about what Pew's doing and when that might roll out. We're expecting probably first of the year. Is that right?
Yeah.
Others?
Well, I'll just add, what I'm really excited about it was that, really looking at term limits, term caps on some of the things, probation and parole, because as everyone has expressed, people are on probation and parole for far too long. And if we can, I would like to see, if you do your time in prison, that's your sentence. I would like to see that, if a person actually has to go to prison and they have a restitution, it's many people that I know that have a $30 million restitution and there's no way they'll pay it at all ever, even if they were on probation for 20 years. So, what's the purpose of them even being on it if they're able to make some type of payment plan that's going to have them do it? And if, after a year to even 3 years, we're putting a cap on that. But that's what I am most excited about. What we were able to collaborate and talk about was that everyone who was at the table really understood that these sentences are far too punitive and disruptive. And a lot of times that people who should not be on them are being overly surveilled, and it's harming people more than it's actually helping.
I was going to say that the most exciting part about being in the room is really being in the room with such amazing professionals that really care about the future of the criminal justice system and really want to change it for the better. And the strategy that I really am fond of is the goal-based supervision, that once someone is done reaching their case plan goals, they should be able to get off supervision and go live back in their communities without the social control of probation. And that is something that we work really hard to do, is get people to the resources. It's very community-based, and so I'm excited about that work.
Thanks. And Vinnie, do you want to talk about what's next for Exit?
Yeah, so Exit is going to have we had our kickoff event at the American Probation and Parole Association conference in San Francisco, and we'll be having an event either late fall or early winter that brings together as many of the 70 as available to come, partly to bond with each other and then partly to sort of open it up so that others can be in the room and kind of talk to us about what kinds of changes they think we should be fomenting. A big one for advocates and government officials in the room is we really want to work with you. We don't envision leading the campaign in your state, but we are experienced commissioners and department heads, and we could help validate. We could show up at press conferences. We can write op-eds. We can help do analysis for you that talks about ways to reduce the size and punitiveness and increase the hope and the help that comes out of community supervision, very much along the lines of the paper that you just described, Judge, that's going to be coming out soon. We don't think we should be the only voice. We think that the voice of people who've been on probation, we think that judges, but we think we should have a voice. And I feel like people running these systems, not just probation and parole, but youth corrections, adult prisons, really haven't stepped up to the plate on that. Every time we're thinking of going to war, you always turn on CNN, you see a bunch of generals debating whether we should go to war or not. We should be in this conversation, and it kind of matters to policymakers. I've seen a lot of elected officials hear things differently from probation and parole commissioners than they hear from advocates. So let's just use that in a way that makes sense.
In the interest of time, I'm not going to ask you, but of course I'm going to put it out there. And I was talking earlier today with someone who heads a prison union, who's in another session now, talking about how important it is that you first go to, right, the line staff. And so I will be, just think about this, we'll open it up, but I want to know how line staff is being engaged in some of this as well. Marc, do you want to talk about what TPPF is doing in this space over the next few months?
Sure. Well, we're having a convening in Austin, October 22nd, bringing policymakers from many different states to talk about really what we've heard today and see kind of based on where each state is in terms of their baseline and kind of what the realm of what's possible, you know, which reforms can be enacted, whether it's incentive funding, earned time, early termination, you know, streamlining conditions, all the things we talked about today. And, you know, I think, of course, diverting people from probation to begin with who don't need to be on there. So we're real excited about that. And we've published, as you referenced, a couple of different papers recently that kind of gave tips to policymakers on, you know, what they can do based on what's worked in so many places already.
Great. Thank you. Last year, we were pressed on, you know, what does this mean? What do we go back and tell our leadership? And we hadn't articulate, but what's important here is I think through exit, through the Pew framework, through Right on Crime, and also from us as well as others, we're pretty clear about saying people should be diverted from the front end so that it's smaller. There should be caps on length of time. There should be some limits, elimination or caps for people to not go back to or be incarcerated for revocations, particularly technicals, that there should be fewer conditions, and that we need to eliminate or curb greatly fines and fees in this space. And to have that kind of consensus along all these different stakeholders is really feels important right now. So we are now going to open it up. And there's lots of hands. Tony, I saw yours first and then here. And I think, I'm not sure what we're doing with mics, but stand up, introduce yourself, and you can grab a mic.
I had two questions. How is the issue of outsourcing?
Hang on just 1 second. Might as well wait. Yeah. Probably gonna not get on TV.
Thank you. How is the issue of outsourcing of supervision being dealt with in some states? And so that's one question. And then my other question is, as a lot of these reforms are being affected, how are these systems working in tangent with other systems such as healthcare and dealing with the resources and enhancement of services that are going to be necessary to support the individuals and their families through that process? Because we see that we're working to make sure people have everything that they need, but then the community isn't resourced in any way to support the people in the community. So what kind of work is being done to also, you know, come along in that? But I'm also, please deal with the outsourcing issue, because that's a huge issue in a lot of states in the South.
Well, and maybe Justice Boggs could talk about, I know there's been some issues with the private probation in Georgia on misdemeanors, that the problem is you have to ask who's the customer, and the person who's being, quote, supervised, because really they're just collecting money, there wasn't much supervision going on, but they're not in position to kind of provide a feedback mechanism. So it really breaks down unless perhaps the judges are going to do that, and I don't think they really have the bandwidth to. So now, on the other hand, you have something like Maine Pretrial Services, which is a nonprofit that does pretrial supervision in a number of rural counties in Maine. And that's been very effective, and they're able to kind of change allocation of resources depending on the needs in what are pretty low populated counties. And obviously provide an alternative to keeping people in jail who can't afford bail, which is obviously a huge and unconstitutional problem. You know, and I think that your second point is a great one. I mean, we're, especially when it comes to parole, we're discharging people from incarceration without the, you know, resources, sometimes without a photo ID to be successful. And that's one of the reasons we started Safe Streets and Second Chances, and also looking at reentry from jail, county jails. And we were able to get something through in Texas where we don't turn off people's, whether it's Medicaid or veterans benefits, we give them 30 days, while most people thankfully get out of jail within 30 days. So, but before we were just terminating people from these programs, and so when they got out, they had to go through weeks or months of reapplying, and meanwhile, they've got to fill their prescription for a mental health medication, right? So we have to set people up for success and not failure, and it does require working with these other systems and sometimes sharing information across different agencies.
Just one thing about private stuff, and then I'll pass it over, but it's really, to me, what's the most disturbing is fee-driven probation, whether it's private or public. I talked to a chief in Texas once and asked them, they had passed a law that allowed early discharge, and not very much early discharge had happened because for some of the small, it happened in the bigger cities that had more money, but in some of these smaller counties, and I think you said there's like 130 counties in Texas, the whole budget was fees. And the best people were the ones you would discharge early. The ones that were actually paying their fees were the ones you would have considered discharging early. So there was like a triple disincentive. You'd lose money, and they were also not reoffending. So your agency's recidivism rate would go up just by subtraction. And so that's true of public. It's also true of private in Tennessee, Alabama. There's litigation over private probation. Some people are on probation, which is really, again, a double kind of whammy, just because at sentencing they couldn't pay restitution or some fees, so they put them on. Yeah, they give them time to pay it, and of course that adds another fee, which, you know, if they were too poor to pay the first thing, they're doubly too poor to pay the next thing.
Thank you for your question. You know, one of the things that I often tell our officers and our policymakers in Multnomah County is eventually the justice-involved individuals on our caseloads are going to have to go back and they have to live in their communities, and they have to know how to navigate the resources in their community. So we need to be building relationships with those community resources so that they can be familiarized with those resources. So we invest a lot of dollars in our community resources. I'm proud to say that we are also one of the MacArthur sites. I see Lori there. Hi. And we're doing some work in the community with housing resources and investing a lot in housing, particularly for African American women in transitional housing, a very underserved population in our jurisdiction. So we can't do this work without community partnerships. And I actually err to the side of putting more resources in the community than I do in building internal programs, because people are only on our supervision for a short amount of time.
Lawrence Bartley, the Marshall Project. I have a question for both Topeka and Vincent. Now, I want to give you a bit of context first. Unfortunately, I was incarcerated at 17 years old. I did 27 years and 2 months. And I've been out for 16 months. Now, while I was incarcerated, I was fortunate enough to take part in a family union program, which I was able to have 2 children. So I have an 11-year-old and a 6-year-old, 2 young children. So when I got out, one of my goals were to get my children out of the neighborhood I grew up in so they could have a better chance. So I did okay enough to purchase a home in another state. Now, in order to get to that state, I have to get a transfer from parole. Now, on the light side of it, well, I've been waiting almost 60 days for that transfer. It hasn't gone through yet. Now, on the light side of it, I have to pay mortgage in another state. I have to pay rent in this state. Plus, I have to pay $30 a month for supervision fees. Now, on the heavy side of it, if I take the chance to go next week to put my 6-year-old on the bus, I can go back to prison. So now, I ask you to, with the work you're doing nationally with probation and parole, and the work you're doing at the Justice Lab with probation and parole, I work in the criminal justice field, so I know how hard it is to get legislation passed on a New York State level. It's probably hard to get executive policy passed. So what can you two actually do to like remedy a situation like this? Particularly in New York State, we have the worst record when it comes to technical violations besides Illinois. So
We're getting legislation passed this year. We're not, don't say it's hard. We're going to get less is more or some version of it passed this year, which dramatically cuts down the reasons for which you could be revoked, and if revoked, dramatically cuts down the amount of time you could get, and does the incentive stuff that Marc talked about. We borrowed a lot of stuff from Right on Crime, from Georgia, from a bunch of states down south, frankly, that have been, I think, ahead of the Northeast and on a bunch of that stuff. And the Bar Association Task Force is meeting on this subject right now, purely on technical violation issues. They're going to issue a report in November. I will introduce you to the co-chairs of it. You should talk to them because they haven't heard from enough formerly incarcerated and formerly supervised people. In my opinion, during this last year and a half when I've been sort of pushing this stuff, I met a guy that was in a homeless shelter because he couldn't go home to his house because his mother, who had a bedroom for him, had a felony conviction. I met a guy that went to prison on a revocation because he married a woman with a felony conviction. I met a guy, I didn't meet him, but I learned of a guy who died, was dying of a heroin overdose, and while he was on his deathbed, his parole officer slapped a violation on him for failing to report. So instead of just dying, he died handcuffed to the bed. And, you know, again, I think about like what's going on there, right? And it's easy to just be mad at the PO, and I'm not mad at the PO, plenty mad, right? But also, what kind of society, what kind of system takes people who are staff who probably didn't come up thinking, you know what I'm going to do when I grow up? I'm going to violate people so they die handcuffed to beds, right? Nobody had that aspiration. And so what does it say about us as a system, as a society, that we're producing people that do that? Now, maybe this guy was an aberrant guy, but I've seen too many of these to think, you know, there's 6,000 violations in New York, probably another 2,000 people voluntarily returned to prison in New York who are on parole. Obviously, they're being threatened with a violation, so they just volunteer and they go back in. So that's 8,000? If you make it 8,000, then we're the highest. We passed Illinois. So, and I could give you a whole bunch of more stories, but I got that look coming from Amy on my side here, so I'm going to pass it over to Pete.
Well, I just, call me because, the work that we do at the Parole and Probation Accountability Project is we help people specifically with those type of issues. So we do early termination of sentences. When there's like interstate transfer issues, we'll file grievances. We do all of that. So once I know what jurisdiction that you're going to and where you're coming from and have a little bit more information, I'll put you in contact with our staff attorney, and then she'll take care of it for you. All right. That's the immediate.
Hi, Steve Finkelstein, Fortune Society. We've heard a lot about how parole and probation work in various jurisdictions here in the United States. I wonder if, Vinnie, you could give us a short report on your recent research trip down under and let us know what observations you've made as to how things work down there and what takeaways you have as to what can be implemented up here.
Can I just throw out a radical idea? There were a ton of hands, get 3 other questions, and then we'll have the panel respond to as much as they can in the remaining minutes. Great, thank you.
Do you want to point to them?
We have 10 minutes, so. Yeah, thanks. We'll get a few questions out.
Okay. Just a quick question. Obviously, one of the great thinkers about community corrections and supervision, Marc died this year, so just curious to hear your thoughts on his legacy and specifically his highlighting of the HOPE program in Hawaii for this national conversation.
Do you have a question, Craig?
I can. I was just going to ask Justice Boggs about the data collection, if the counties are forthcoming with that, because that seems to be what we're missing. We just looked at Michigan's on Friday, and everyone in the room was literally laughing. It was the first time we've ever looked at data in Michigan at what people are going to jail for, and I just want to know if they cooperate.
And if we can have just 2 more, one question.
Sure. So I was a public defender for about 15 years. And what I saw over and over again is somebody who's on probation and makes mistakes along the way. And then there's like the 8th mistake at the very end that is nowhere near as bad as the mistake in making the original crime. It's this desistance that I think Vinnie talks about, where it is something that is less and there's more time in between violations. And I still don't see that taking hold in probation offices at all. So I'm wondering how far away do you think we are where probation officers and judges can actually look at a violation in the context of the amount of time and in comparing it to the original sentence, as opposed to saying, this is the 10th time you've screwed up and therefore we have, you're a bad, what do they say? You're not eligible, what is it? What's the saying? It's like you're not a good bet on probation. We've all heard that 1,000 times, right? You're not eligible, not eligible. Anyway, What? Yeah, maybe amenable to probation, but yeah. So I'm wondering how far away you think we are from people actually looking at it through the lens of desistance.
Thanks for your patience putting all this out. Why don't we just start with, if anyone, we'll start with Marc, come down for responding, if you'd like to respond to some of these.
Yeah, well, I knew Professor Kleinman, brilliant fellow, and obviously the book When Brute Force Fails really was relevant to this discussion because, the idea that just through threatening sanctions you can get people's behavior to change, it doesn't always work. It often doesn't, and a lot of that is people don't think they're going to be caught, of course. But the other aspect is, especially relates to people on supervision, is how do you give people hope and a path forward for a different trajectory? And instead, we put all of these barriers that we've been talking about today, we put them on these on folks, and so we actually make the path that we want them to take more difficult to follow. And it just seems so obvious. But I think the other thing is, obviously, with the Hope Court, it had great success with Judge Alm in Hawaii, but there were some challenges in replicating it in other jurisdictions, and I think that's relevant to this discussion as well, because what we've always heard, there's some probation officers, half of them wanted to be social workers, half of them wanted to be police officers. So who you get can really affect how your case is handled. And but one of the things, if you look at the area of education research, there's all these studies that the most powerful factor that influences someone's learning is teacher quality. But if you do a Google search on probation officer quality, you get nothing. So all these great ideas, we have to have the right personnel to implement them. So that's critical.
Doesn't matter what order we answer these in. Question in the back concerning the quality of and cooperation of the counties with respect to providing probation revocation data. In my experience, the challenge is not per se getting the counties to comply, because we're on we have 159 counties, but those sentences are required to be uploaded and included into the GBI, Georgia Bureau of Investigation, GCIC, Georgia Crime Information Center website and database. The problem is, as with any data, it's garbage in and garbage out. And so when CSG conducted this analysis, you will see 45% of state prison admissions nationwide are due to violations of probation or for new offenses for a technical violation. The way it's coded matters in order to disaggregate and determine that 25% of those are technical violations. The problem is most of the probation revocations, well, not most, many of the probation revocations that I presided over involved a new offense. They would plea to the new offense. You would run the probation revocation concurrent with the sentence on the new offense. It would get coded at corrections as a new offense, and it wasn't coded as a revocation. It was a revocation because, as I started, the new offense only had to be proven by a preponderance and not beyond a reasonable doubt. They knew that, and so they would plead to the new offense, and they would get revoked on probation. And so the question was, what is it? Is it a revocation or is it a new sentence? And so the challenge we've had in our particular state, and I've seen this in other states, is how do you disaggregate that data in a meaningful way in order to determine how many are technicals actually and how many are new offenses. And so data is always a problem. It's a problem in all criminal justice reform efforts that I've been involved in. In juvenile justice arena, we had to develop a data dictionary and a data exchange so that different management information systems could collaborate and we could at least get something meaningful out of their download of the data. So that's where we are in Georgia. I hope that helps answer your question.
Did you want to? I want to echo something Topeka said a little earlier.
No, this is also your
This is my closing statement, yep.
revelations from
Which
the
goes
doctor.
to, this is, yeah. So this kind of fits with what you said. What I saw in New Zealand was the Maori iwi, the tribe, had basically said, we don't want you to send our kids to remand anymore, which was either 3.5 or 6.5 hours away from way up north where the tribe was. So when you want to detain one of our kids, we got them. The tribe's got them. They'll live with a family all day long. A couple of mentors will watch them, but also mentor them and try to encourage them to reattach themselves to the tribe, which is going to be the best, and as my colleague Bruce Western says, the thickest brand of safety, not the thin brand we'll get by detaining them temporarily and depositing them back home. And I want to go back to something Topeka said earlier, and she said it, she kind of zipped past it, but it was pretty profound, that the sentence should just be the sentence and then nothing else afterwards. So essentially that's like abolish post-release supervision or abolish parole. When the country was moving from indeterminate to determinate sentencing, a lot of people were saying that out loud. And it was Arthur Lyman, it was Judge Lasker here in New York, it was commissions were recommending it, Marty Horn, who's a professor here, former head of corrections in Pennsylvania and New York, former head of probation and parole in New York, were saying out loud, we shouldn't have post-release supervision, and we should calculate how much that saves and put it in the communities where people come from, where people in those communities can create a thick brand of public safety like the Maori Iwi does in Northland in New Zealand. I think it deserves a fair shot. I think it deserves a fair analysis, a fair look. I think we should really kick the tires and say, if post-release supervision from prison didn't exist now, would we hire a bunch of government bureaucrats to do it? Or would we do it in the neighborhoods from which people come? Would we put guns on people and have them piss test people and have 20 conditions? My bet is a whole bunch of it wouldn't be invented this way if we were inventing it right now. And that the only reason we're going to do it tomorrow is because we did it yesterday. And I think that's a bad reason when it comes to doing things that deprive people of their liberty. That is not Exit's position, by the way. That's me talking.
Unless someone has a burning thought, I think I'm going to close. I think we're at time, but I want to thank this amazing panel. I want to acknowledge Vinnie for having very few curse words in the entire panel. And I do hope that we come back next year again and have more leaders on the Exit roster. We have more states that have more legislative wins. We have more human beings who have resolved issues like this and are living in the community and thriving. And just, we are here if you have questions afterwards, and thank you to our panel.
Thank you.